I'll see if we're hooked up here. Can everybody hear me? Okay, that's a start. And I'll see if I can work this contraption here. Let me just test it out here. Yeah. I'm here today, I guess you might say, and I'll tell you in advance that I'll probably go over the limit, and so I've already warned him in advance that he just shuts me off whenever he feels like it, okay? Or whenever everybody in here, gets tired of it, and we'll pick up the next time, whatever that is. As you can see from the picture, both of those pictures are about 5 months apart. First one was when I graduated from Officer Candidate School, and the second one was just off the coast of Vietnam in Vung Tau when we were landing about 5 months later at the start of my career in the war in Vietnam. I titled this Infantry Playground for Pawns, primarily because the infantry are the pawns. No matter who it is up the chain, at the end of the line, it's always the infantry who has to carry things out. And just to put it in perspective, a couple months ago, I found a little quote, and I don't remember where it was, but what it said is that since the end of World War II, the infantry, and when I say infantry, I mean Marines and Army. I mean, if you were on Tarawa or Iwo Jima, you were infantry. And what I found was that while infantry is only 4% of the military, it has 80% of the combat deaths. So anybody who joins the infantry or is in the infantry probably knows that they're in a rather hazardous business or line of work. So I call it Playground for Pawns. Simply because it's a deadly playground, but one that is actually very necessary if you're ever going to win a war. Now, let me see if I can get this thing to, there we go. We all have a beginning somewhere. Somehow the universe started with a big bang. Well, I didn't have a big bang, but I did start, and I began. My birth was in a place that nobody can ever spell. Ypsilanti, Michigan. If I ask you, how many of you can spell it? Probably not very many of you. Somewhere between Ann Arbor and Detroit in southeastern Michigan. I was born there, have not been back since. So that shows you, how valued I think my birthplace was. The rest of these are examples of my childhood. Don't ask me why I figured this was more important than going to high school and other things, but the only one that, well, the two in the middle are the most important. As you can see on the one in the bottom, I was a pretty budding athlete with a croquet mallet. I gave that career up very early in the game, however. And the top picture shows you who I was. I was a PK, which is a preacher's kid. And so if you want to know who else runs around from place to place, in addition to the military, it's people who are preacher's kids. I went to 8 schools in 12 years. So that gives you an indication that before I got to the military, I was well schooled in how to get around from one place to another. And in my dad's case, he was mostly in one form or another with the United Methodist Church, although there were various denominations. And we were in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana. When I graduated from high school, I went, I had 2 years of college at the University of Chicago, and after 2 years I was more confused than I had been before. I had done a bunch of general ed classes, but what I did know is what I planned on doing I didn't want to do anymore. So I decided to take some time off, and the Army was one alternative, which is exactly what I went into. I signed up for 3 years, and they had an option at that time. You could either sign up to where you wanted to go or what you wanted to do. Well, from my perspective, I wanted one thing. I wanted to go to Europe. And I didn't care what it was they assigned me to do. And so I joined, and they sent me to Fort Knox to basic training. As you all know, you take a whole battery of tests when you go in the military, and I had more than I can remember, but one of them happened to be an officer candidate school test. And I passed it, but I didn't want the additional time, so I turned them down. Well, I don't know if that was the reason they sent me where I ended up, but they decided that if I didn't want to become an officer, I should be a cook. And so I said, no, you know, you just found the one thing that I did not want to spend the next 3 years doing. And so after basic training, I went to Fort Knox, or went to the, what they called, it's actually food service school, but they called it cook school. And as soon as I walked in there, I said, hey, I don't want to go to cook school. I'm putting in for OCS. They said, okay, fine, but you still have to go through the school. So for the next 8 weeks, we're going to be going through cook school. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I spent a lot of that time processing for OCS. I don't know why they had so many things and tests that you had to go through at the time, but I spent a lot of time doing it. And in fact, at the end of the 8 weeks, they had the final exam, and I even missed the final test. And so I come in and I asked them, well, what do I do now? They said, well, you have a choice. You can take the course again. Obviously, that was not something I wanted to do. And the other option is you got to take a final exam of 50 multiple choice questions. And I said, I missed a lot of the classes. How am I going to pass? Well, that's your choice. So he stuck me in a supply room, and I sat down and went through the 50 multiple choice questions. And if you want to know multiple guess, boy, that was a test of multiple guess. And so I figured I'm going to be spending another 8 weeks at cook school. A couple days later, I'm sitting on my footlocker in the barracks, and up comes this sergeant, sticks out his hand to me, and says, congratulations, you're the honor graduate. So that sort of told me exactly what cook school exams were like. At any rate, I guess I'm proud of the fact. I haven't really decided yet. But one of the things that was nice about the school, they really actually did a lot of nice things for me, and I have only nice things to say about the school. They knew by this time that I was going to OCS, so they sent me to a number of schools on the base there at Fort Knox that were leadership oriented. One was a tank commander school, because it was the armor school there. And I went through that. As soon as I got back, they sent me to an NCO academy for E5s and E6s. Now understand that at this time, I was an E2. Okay? I didn't even have my first stripe. So they sent me to the school. I went through 6 weeks. Actually ended up being one of the honor graduates there too, which was really surprising. When I came back, they gave me acting corporal stripes and put me in charge of 2 of the platoons going through cook school. And I spent the rest of the time, the summer and into the fall, waiting for my notice to go to Fort Benning. So, in case this thing works and doesn't work, let's see, there I am in cook school, and there I am when it comes to the NCO Academy. So, I got my notice to go to Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia in September, and so come October, I keep hitting the wrong one here, don't I? I end up going to Fort Benning, Georgia. Now, Anybody in here has gone through OCS or OCS-like? You know what it's like. It's basically, in this case, it was 6 months. And 6 months to train you to lead people in combat. And essentially, I think you could say that they're trying to get you to quit. Because if you're going to quit, they want you to quit there, not out on the battlefield where you got 40 other lives at stake. Now, I titled this Spitters, Not Buffers. Now, all of you are probably familiar with buffering. There was the buffer that, well, I guess they do wax the floors here. And a few years later, that's what they adopted. But when I went through, we were spitters. Now, what does that mean? In addition to spit shining your boots, which you're probably all familiar with, we had to spit shine our floors in our room. Every day, spit shine your floor and spit shine your way down the hallway. In fact, the day I got my commission, I spit shined my way out of my room and down the hall. And anybody who can put up with that for 6 months probably deserves a little gold bar. The other things there I'll let you look at. One of the things that I will mention is, you see that opt-out in the third line down there? The first thing we had to do when we got to the school was write on a sheet of paper, I hereby wish to withdraw from Officer Candidate School. And you put that under glass on your desk, and all you had to do was sign it, and you were out of there. Every morning you woke up and said, maybe today. And 5 minutes later you were so busy until the next day. So 6 months of OCS, and we finally got our commission. And then we got our orders. And everybody got orders. Some went to the 1st Cav, some went to Airborne, some went to Ranger School. Mine were to go to Fort Riley, Kansas, which is where the 1st Infantry Division was. And once I got to Fort Riley, I was assigned as a platoon leader to C Company 228th Infantry, the Black Lions. The Black Lions got that logo from World War I. It's called the Black Lion of Cantigny because the 1st Division Black Lions were one of the first units, American units, to fight in World War I. Whoops. Now, I was there probably a month. There were 2 brigades at Fort Riley, Kansas. The 2nd Brigade got notice around July that they were going to Vietnam. And then they pointed at us and said, you're next. So by the end of August, we were getting ready to go to Vietnam. And on, I think it was September the 2nd, we flew, some of the equipment went by rail, but we flew to Oakland, and from there we got on board the Daniel S. Sultan, which was a World War II troop ship, for 22 days across the Pacific. And the 2 pictures that you see there are our arrival at just off the coast of Vung Tau, which was a resort town southeast of Saigon. Now, a couple things that you will notice, and I should also mention, I got these pictures from the History Channel. They had a program on the history of the 1st Division I was watching, and I said, oh, lo and behold, my God, I got 5 seconds of FaceTime. And so I made a copy, from this. You will notice, while I am sitting there, all of the things that you normally associate with the Vietnam War are not present. In other words, the M16, jungle fatigues, jungle boots, and in many cases, flak jackets. If you will notice my sitting there, you'll see that I have an M14 slung over my shoulder. You'll see I am wearing starched, tailored fatigues from OCS, which is what we had to have. We had 10 sets that we had to wear when we were there. And I'm sure I was not wearing jungle boots. In fact, we didn't get our allocation of what you might say Vietnam era clothing and weapons until almost 2 months later. So, like every army in every war, you go with what you got, and that's what we had. So we landed at Vung Tau, and then they shipped us, they actually threw us in a C-130 aircraft to Benoit, where we acclimated for a couple of weeks, after which we then convoyed up to our new home, which was going to be Lai Khe, Vietnam. We were part of a whole group of people who were trying to put a cordon or an umbrella around Saigon. Because the reason we were there in the first place is because, while Lyndon Johnson said, we don't want American boys to be doing what Asian boys ought to be doing, defending their country, by the time we arrived, it had gotten to the point where only American boys were actually going to save Saigon. And so the first thing, and we were part of that early contingent that said, we're going to put a protective sheath around the Saigon area. The three maps that are here, and I think I'll go up here because this thing isn't working well enough to be able to do anything. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So if you want to know where Lai Khe is, you can see it down here. And you can see it's at the very end of the trail. And so a lot of activity is going into this area. And in fact, I can also say that that's this area here, and this area actually is, excuse me, this area has long been under the control of the NLF or the VC. At least since 1954, and maybe as far back as 1945. And so you can see War Zone C and War Zone D, and you can see where Lai Khe is, if I can get this thing to work. There's Lai Khe right in the middle of it. Right in the middle, that red line is Highway 13. Most of our activities were up and down Highway 13, from Saigon in the south all the way to the top of that, top of the picture, which is the Cambodian border in Loc Ninh. And I'll mention two different areas where I have a couple illustrations. One is Cu Chi, where all the tunnels are. And the second one is this Michelin rubber plantation, which is up Highway 13 and to the west as an entry zone into War Zone C. And we'll see, so if you can keep those in mind, we'll see both of those in some of the later slides. The one to the right is sort of a mock-up of Lai Khe itself. You can see Highway 13 going right up through the middle. It was an old, I won't say abandoned, but it was sort of semi-use. It was an experimental rubber plantation, and we had 3 battalions around Lai Khe. That was our new home base. Another picture of Lai Khe, aerial views and photographs. The one on the left, and these are very dark, but that's exactly the way it was most of the time. You can see off in the distance, you can see some of the squad tents where we were located in the rubber trees. The area on the right is another schematic of Lai Khe. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little box square off to the right front. That was our company zone. That's where we were located. And I had a weapons platoon, and so I was located to the rear of the 3 platoons that were out to the front. Off to the right front were all rice paddies. At the base of the hill was a hooch, a little Vietnamese thatched house, if you want to call it that, the people who worked the rice paddies to the front. Now, one of the things that you learned very, very early on in Vietnam is that there are two challenges that you faced. One was environmental, and the other was combat related. Certainly, the part about the environment, you know all about it. The monsoons, snakes, scorpions, leeches, all of these wonderful things that you go home and you're looking for in your backyard. And malaria, dengue fever, and all kinds of fungus. I got one on my eardrum one time. Fungus on your body. Trench foot, especially before we got jungle boots. So one of the things that happened, we set up our mortars right behind the unit. Unbeknownst to us, we set it right in the middle of a whole nest of cobras. We killed 9 cobras in the first month, including one. I was standing in the squad tent area talking to one of my men who was getting a dry pair of boots out. Went into his duffel bag, pulled out the boots. He always dumped them out because of scorpions. Only he had a really big scorpion. He dumps it out and his eyes get bigger than the moon. And it's a cobra. And so you can imagine, here he comes and the snake right behind him. And fortunately we killed him and not killed the snake and not the man. But that was sort of an indication of what we were in for the rest of the time we were there. Now, right from the start, we also had a combat-related issue that relates to the complications of being in Vietnam and the operations that you had to work within. Remember I talked about that hooch down to the front. After a day or two, we had a wake-up call every single morning about 6 o'clock. We would hear bloop, 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 bloop. Then about 30 seconds of silence, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 down in the rice paddy. And we would say, somebody's firing at us. So we would call down to Ben Cat. Ben Cat was just south, it was the district headquarters for the Vietnamese government. And they had an American advisor. We'd call down there and say, somebody's shooting at us. And the advisor would say, no, 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 they're friendlies. The next morning, same thing, all over again. Bloop, 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 bloop. 4, no more, no less. 4. This went on for a week until I'm laying in my cot and I say, okay, it's 6 o'clock and okay, here it is again. And you'd sort of roll over for a few more Z's. Only this morning it was a little different. It was bloop, 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 bloop. About the 5th or 6th one, man, I am up and I am out of my cot and I'm into my tactical operations center. And as I'm going down inside, one of the rounds explodes in the trees overhead. And for the next few minutes, we had rounds bouncing all over the place, in trees, out of trees, landing on the ground, exploding all over the place. And after it was over, we went out to see what the damage was. And fortunately, his aim was good, but fortunately, we had a few dud rounds. In fact, one was right up against our 81 millimeter mortar ammo that we had. Fortunately, that one didn't go off because, trust me, there would have been a huge explosion. Went back to my cot, and I noticed my cot was full of holes. So one of the rounds that exploded in the trees overhead, fortunately I was not a sound sleeper because otherwise I would have had a very short tour in Vietnam. So right from the start, you can see some of the complications. Now, when this happened, my company commander calls me and says, hey, bring up one of your 106s. So they were mounted on Jeeps, as we'll see a little bit later. And so I wheel it up, and he puts it right on the perimeter and says, fire one round into that hooch, which he does. The round not only goes into the hooch, it went right through the hooch and landed and exploded down in the rice paddies. About 2 hours later, here comes this ox cart. I mean, loaded obviously with everything they own. Right up, literally, right through our lines. And you're just, with the ox leading, going slowly, ended up out at Highway 13, and that was the last we saw of it, and it was the last time that we had any mortar attacks, from that area. But it did point out that you didn't really know who was a friend and who was a foe. one of the things that they taught us during orientation when we were on our way over to Vietnam is they said, well, the VC don't have regular uniforms. They have black pajamas. So that was nice. Everybody in a VC uniform is wearing black pajamas. What they didn't tell us is so does everybody else wearing black pajamas. So it was really of no help whatsoever in that sense. So we learned a great lesson that we all took with us, but unfortunately it did limit what we could do while we were there. One thing, to go back for just a moment, one thing I can say about War Zone C and War Zone D, they were called free fire zones. Anybody who had extra ammunition, planes that needed to unload things, they could just drop it anywhere in there, and it was acceptable practice at that time. I will also mention one other thing, and that is the dreaded iron triangle, which people have heard about from time to time. But all of these were areas that the VC had for a long period of time, and we're not about to give them up. I had a weapons platoon. I started off with a line platoon, but by the time we got all the recruits in to go to Vietnam, I was a senior lieutenant. Unfortunately, what I found out is the two weapon systems that I had, a 106 recoilless rifle and 81 millimeter mortars, were not exactly well tuned for the operations we were going to be going on in Vietnam. Since we weren't going to be on roads and the roads were going to be dangerous, essentially the 106s ended up as perimeter security. And after about one operation, carrying 81 millimeter mortars through triple canopy jungle, you found out that is not going to work either unless you're carrying chainsaws to be able to cut down the jungle to have some kind of a pattern to be able to fire them. You would have to have one person on the tube, another person carrying the base plate, a third person carrying all the other peripherals, and then you would need to have somebody to carry ammunition. Who's going to do that? So we quickly figured out that what we need are 60 millimeter mortars. At the time that I was wounded and left, we still did not have our 60 millimeter mortars. But you can see right from the start what my mission was. It was going to be pretty hard to actually carry it out. The picture on the left is Highway 13. The reason I show you this is you can see it's a clear path down that road. This is post-Agent Orange. When I was there, it was brush and, I don't want to say jungle, but high grass all the way up to the road. And it was very easy to sit there and start an ambush anytime you wanted it, and nobody would ever see anything of you. So if you want to know one of the reasons why Agent Orange was introduced, that road is one of the examples of why. Now, for the first couple weeks, our line platoons did exploration around our perimeter to make sure that you cleared the area. It wasn't, one other thing that I will mention here let me go back one step.
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, I'll see what I can get done in 10 minutes. Highway 13, one of the things that I had to do was I had to be a convoy commander to get supplies down in Saigon. Back then, you didn't have anybody clearing for mines. We just drove down there and drove back. So I go down, on the way down, it was always going to be safe. However, on the way back, that's when you had to worry, because you were down there overnight, getting loaded up, and then coming back. And on the way back, the one time I was convoy commander, I lost 4 vehicles. I lost a 5-ton loaded with replacement people, a couple killed and about a dozen wounded. I lost a deuce and a half, I lost a 3/4 ton, and I lost a Jeep with my first sergeant and one of the platoon sergeants. There's an addendum to this story, and that is this was after 9/11. I was at the wall in Washington, D.C., and I'm standing there looking at the wall where the two walls come together. I'm standing there looking for some of the people that I knew, and this middle-aged lady walks up with her teenage son. And he takes his umbrella, points it up, and I could see he's talking about Sergeant Dickens. And I looked at her and I said, "You knew Sergeant Dickens?" "Yes, he was my brother-in-law." And she says, "How did you know him?" I said, "Well, I was a platoon leader where he was in the company that he was the first sergeant." And then I told her, I said, "And I still feel responsible for his death." Why? Because he asked me, "Where should I go in the convoy?" And I said, "Get a couple vehicles behind me and you'll be safer there." As it turned out, that was not true. And because of that, she was very thankful, believe it or not, because they had never been told how he died. And I said, "Well, one thing was for sure, he did not suffer. It happened so fast he never even knew what happened." So, we start out on search and destroy. This was one of the things that you could always depend on. If you talk about Vietnam, it was search and destroy. And so our first major operation, as you can see, for over a week, going through triple canopy jungle, again, without our jungle boots. And on the way back, we had to convoy with our vehicles, and the convoy became personal for me, because along the road, remember that Michelin rubber plantation that I mentioned to you? On the way, we got ambushed, and our convoy got split, and it was for probably 2 or 3 miles. So it was really long. And how I got my Silver Star was I was in the back part of the operation, and after about 15, 20 minutes, I decided we got to get moving again. It had been raining, muddy. We were making maybe 100, 200 yards an hour. Not making very good time, but I was able to get a couple of sergeants. We got the people, the drivers, got it moving again, took about 15, 20 people and put a clearing operation and started down the road. And picking up some wounded along the way, picking up equipment and so on. A part of the way down, I found a sergeant that I was actually putting on a stretcher along the side of the road, carrying my .45, and all of a sudden I could see a flash out of the corner of my eye. And the next thing I knew, I was laying in the ditch on the opposite side of the road. And the subsequent rounds were bouncing up over the top of my head. And fortunately, I was in the ditch and not on top of the road, otherwise I would not be here today. So it's a funny thing. I wiggled my toes, they worked. I could see this was fine, tried to raise my weapon. About that time, somebody threw a grenade and knocked the guy out. But I could look at my arm, I could see the bone, but it had not hit the bone. So of all the things that could have happened, I probably had the one thing that was most fortunate. And so from there, we went down, we went the rest of the way down to a holding area. It took us about 4 or 5 hours, after which I went to 3rd Field, to an evac hospital, and eventually spent 6 weeks in Saigon at 3rd Field Hospital. After which, I came back to the Lai Khe, got back to Lai Khe, and I was still sort of mending because my arm was out like this. They wanted to send me to Japan, but I didn't want to go back for therapy. And so I started working out with weights, got infected along the way. But from January until June, we went on more of these major search and destroy operations. One was in Kuchi, where you can see the example of what these tunnels were like. We discovered them. The 25th Division that we were clearing for, came in after that and spent a lot of their time doing this. I then became S3 Air, spent a lot of time in little OH-13 helicopters over operations. The final operation that I was on, another one right up near the Cambodian border, where you can see there's a special forces camp, and we settled around an airstrip there. And so those two pictures, tell you what it looked like up near the Cambodian border. We spent most of our time in that year fighting 271, 272, 273, three Viet Cong regiments of the 9th Infantry Division. The last picture that I want to show you here is one that I sort of, typifies what it's like to be infantry, and also the capriciousness of what it's like to be in combat. You can see, what you see there is a little 2-seater porta potty, which was right in the middle of our perimeter for everybody to use. One afternoon, there were 2 people sitting on it, and we got hit with a mortar attack. The one on the right just hit the ground. Forget dignity, just hit the ground. The one on the left stooped to pick up his pants. While he was doing so, a mortar round hit nearby and he was killed. So if you want to know what the capriciousness of combat is, make sure you make the right decision. Now, the problem is, even if you make the right decision, it doesn't guarantee that you're still going to come out alive. You still gotta be lucky. And there is no substitute for luck. I hate to say that. The only reason that I am here is because of that. One other picture that I'll show you, and that is what I did after I left. I left in July of 1966. I was supposed to go back to Fort Ord, California. I said, I don't want to go back. I decided I'm going to stay in Vietnam, but I don't want to be in the field. So I found a job, and down in Saigon became the executive officer of the headquarters company, 4th Transportation Command, the people who ran the Saigon port. So I went from one extreme in the infantry to supplying all the things for everybody else in Vietnam along the Saigon River. We lived in the Li Lai Hotel in downtown Saigon, right next to the Central Market. And there's a whole story about that, but we're not going to go into it today. And so I will throw it open for questions if there's time. If anybody has, there are lots of other things that I could have included but didn't. But I can say it was an interesting experience, one that you can only get this way if you can live through it. Time for any questions or no?
Are there any questions? You can use the mic.
As a retired cook, did you help the food chain any?
No. We had sea rations. Although I got so sick of sea rations, I went and gave away all my food in return for those little tins of bread and peanut butter and jelly, and that's what I lived on for the last couple of months. But the downside was, everywhere I went, they made me food service officer.
Lieutenant Matter, could you speak to the training you received before you going to Vietnam? Was it adequate?
We didn't really have a lot of training going to Vietnam. Other than probably the best thing that we had was some of the orientations, but unfortunately nobody really knew. It was so early in the game that, yeah, okay, we're going over there, but it was all stereotypes and nobody really knew what you were going to be getting into. It was all trial and error. And probably you could say the infantry is trial and error even under the best of circumstances, but even more so than usual. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Seems like we were trial and error even in 1970.
Yeah, I would say that everywhere you went, there's going to be trial and error. Because the one thing you have to remember in the infantry, the other side gets a vote. So you do things to try, in other words, we were the guinea pigs most of the time. They set the agenda on whether or not there was going to be a battle or not. We didn't. We'd go out just like that one operation that I talked to you about. That we, in essence, we could search for them, but if they didn't want to be found, there was nothing you could do. So we were out there trying to get caught, and hopefully our firepower would be enough to be able to overwhelm them. But they soon figured out how to get around that too. That was one of the lessons of the Battle of Ia Drang as well.
All your experience, especially with OCS and then when you were platoon over here in Vietnam, when you came back, were discharged, you came back home to this country, did you start your own business, or did you feel like you could start your own business if you wanted to?
Actually, what I did after I got out of the service, I went back to Vietnam. And I spent the next 5 years over there working for 3 military contractors, including one, a company. I was working on supply parts for the AH-1G, the Cobra, during the Tet Offensive of 1968. In fact, I was up there during the Tet Offensive of '68. We had rockets going out over our Quonset hut every night and exploding across the street. Spent a year at Phan Rang for a company. I worked for another company that built all those roads and bridges. And so when I saw North Vietnamese tanks coming in 1975, I said, I helped build all of those. So.
Thank you, Kirby. This is all the time we have. Thank you very much. Kirby has joined us, and he'll be speaking to the high school students, I think, tomorrow.